Have you ever heard a story so old it feels like it's been part of the world forever? Stories about great floods washing the earth clean, about gods walking among humans, about cities lost beneath the waves' tales, whispered around campfires, carved into temple walls, and passed down from grandparent to child for thousands of years. What if these weren't just stories? What if they were memories? Consider this. From the Epic of Gilgamesh in Mesopotamia to the biblical account of Noah, from indigenous flood narratives in the Americas to deluge myths in ancient China and India, cultures separated by continents and oceans all tell versions of the same cataclysmic event. It's as if humanity itself is trying to tell us something real, something seismic, something that actually happened. These aren't just random fictions. They're echoes of earthquakes, of melting glaciers, of rising seas that reshaped coastlines and rewrote human destiny. They're shape-shifting narrative stories that disguise history as folklore, preserving truth in the language of symbol, metaphor, and wonder. Folklore, it turns out, is far more than entertainment. It's a vessel, a living archive, a way for communities to carry forward what matters most, not in dry history books, but in vibrant, memorable tales layered with meaning. When trauma strikes, a volcano erupts, an invader arrives, a culture falls, people don't just record dates. They tell stories. They turn fear into myth, heroes into legends, and real events into epic narratives that can travel across generations without fading. That's the incredible alchemy of oral tradition. It takes the raw material of history and forges it into something durable, something resonant, something that doesn't just inform us but moves us. And in doing so, these stories become something even more powerful than fact. They become part of who we are. So what if the tales we've long dismissed as fantasy are actually coded messages from the past? What if mythology is just history in disguise? In this video, we're going to explore 20 astonishing examples where folklore secretly carries the weight of real events, where ancient memories are hidden in plain sight, woven into the very fabric of our oldest stories. We'll journey from the sunken kingdom of Atlantis to the heroic sagas of King Arthur, from the shape-shifting beings of Navajo tradition to the golden cities sought by Spanish conquistadors. We'll see how myth and reality aren't opposites, they're partners in a grand, unfolding human story. And by the end, you may never listen to an old tale the same way again. So how does this incredible transformation actually happen? How does a real event over centuries become a myth? It all comes down to the very nature of storytelling itself, a living, breathing process that scholars call the shape-shifting narrative. Think of a story not as a stone tablet, fixed and unchanging, but more like a river. It flows through time, carving new channels, picking up sediments from each generation it passes through. The core current, the historical event, remains, but its details are smoothed, its edges are polished, and its meaning is deepened by every storyteller who adds their own perspective. This is the magic of oral tradition. Before the written word, this was how knowledge was preserved. But it wasn't about memorizing facts verbatim. It was about preserving the emotional and cultural truth of an event in a package memorable enough to survive. The scholar Mircea Eliade argued that myths aren't just false stories about the past. They are sacred histories that connect a community to a deeper, more meaningful time of origins. They answer fundamental questions: who are we? Why are we here? How did our world come to be? By framing a historical event within this cosmic context, a society makes it matter. It becomes a foundational pillar of their identity, not just a date in a forgotten chronicle. This process is especially powerful when a community needs to process something traumatic or overwhelmingly significant. A volcanic eruption, a devastating war, a great flood. These are cataclysmic events that can shatter a culture's understanding of the world. How do you make sense of such chaos? You turn it into a story. You give the incomprehensible forces of nature a face, an angry god, a displeased spirit. You transform the fear and loss into a narrative of struggle, heroism, or divine punishment with a moral lesson. This doesn't erase the history, it encodes it. It makes the trauma manageable, palatable, and ultimately survivable for the collective memory. The story becomes a tool for resilience, a way to say, we went through this and we are still here. Joseph Campbell's work on the monomyth, or the hero's journey, shows us that while the specific details of these stories vary wildly from culture to culture, their underlying structure is remarkably universal. A hero hears a call to adventure, faces trials, achieves a boon, and returns transformed. This pattern resonates because it mirrors our own human experiences of struggle, growth, and survival. It's a template onto which any number of historical events can be mapped, ensuring the story's message is instinctively understood across time and culture. A perfect example of this alchemy at work is the legendary Trojan War, immortalized in Homer's epic poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey. For centuries, these were considered to be purely brilliant works of fiction, fantastical tales of proud Achilles, cunning Odysseus, and the beautiful Helen whose face launched 1,000 ships. But what if there was a real war at the heart of it all? Archaeological excavations at the site of Hisarlik in modern-day Turkey have revealed a city that matches the description of Troy, a strategic coastal settlement that was destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, including a layer showing evidence of a catastrophic fire and warfare around the 12th century BC. This doesn't mean we have proof of a 10-year siege, or that the gods Apollo and Athena literally took to the battlefield. Instead, it suggests that a major historical conflict between the Mycenaean Greeks and the powerful city of Troy, or Wilusa, as it was known in Hittite records, left such a deep scar on the cultural memory of the Aegean world that it became the foundational saga for ancient Greece. Over hundreds of years of oral retelling by bards, the historical kings and warriors were elevated to superhuman status, their strategic battles amplified with divine intervention, and their personal struggles magnified into archetypal tales of rage, love, and destiny. The historical fact provided the spark, but the collective need for a story that defined Greek heroism and identity provided the fuel, creating a shape-shifting narrative that has captivated us for millennia. And so we arrive at the first and perhaps most profound example of this phenomenon, a story so universal it seems etched into our species' very DNA, the legend of the Great Flood. From the deck of Noah's Ark to the desperate prayers of Utnapishtim in the Epic of Gilgamesh, from the Greek hero Deucalion repopulating the earth with stones to ancient Hindu texts telling of Manu saving life from a deluge, the narrative is eerily consistent. A divine warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel of salvation, and a world cleansed by water. The sheer geographic spread of this story, found in hundreds of cultures from the Americas to Australia, points to something far deeper than cultural exchange. It suggests a shared, primal memory of a cataclysm so immense it became a cornerstone of human mythology. But what could have caused such a globally recognized trauma? The answer may lie buried deep beneath the waves and sediments of our planet, dating back to the tumultuous end of the last ice age. As massive glaciers began to melt around 12,000 years ago, they unleashed unimaginable volumes of water back into the world's oceans. Sea levels rose hundreds of feet, not in a slow, gentle creep, but in dramatic, terrifying surges. Vast coastal plains that were once home to early human settlements, entire continents of fertile land now lost to us, like Doggerland between Britain and Europe or the Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, were swallowed by the sea in what must have felt like a geological instant. For the communities living there, this wasn't a gradual change, it was an apocalypse. The world they knew literally vanished beneath the waves, an event so catastrophic it could only be explained as the wrath of the gods. This theory moves from compelling speculation to tangible science with groundbreaking work like the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, proposed by geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman. Their research paints a startling picture of the Black Sea Basin around 7,600 years ago. They argue it was then a vast freshwater lake, lying hundreds of feet below the level of the rising Mediterranean Sea. And then the natural dam of the Bosporus Strait gave way. What followed was a cataclysm of biblical proportions. Seawater thundered through the breach with a force 200 times greater than Niagara Falls, submerging over 60,000 square miles of land at a rate of about 6 inches per day. For the Neolithic farmers living along those shores, the world would have ended in a relentless, roaring wall of water. Their homes, their fields, their entire world disappeared forever beneath a salty sea. Could this have been the original flood? It's a powerful candidate, an event local to the cradle of Western civilization that perfectly matches the scale and terror described in Mesopotamian and later biblical traditions. The story wouldn't have stayed put. It would have traveled with the refugees who fled inland, carrying their trauma and their tale of a great drowning to new cultures, who then adapted it to their own landscapes and beliefs. This process of adaptation is key to understanding how a single historical event can spawn 1,000 different myths. In landlocked regions, the story might transform from an oceanic deluge to a massive river flood. In the Andes, the flood myth of the Inca people tells of Yunu Pachacuti, a great water cataclysm from the sky and sea. For the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest, stories tell of a time when the waters rose to cover all but the tallest mountains, a likely memory of rapid post-glacial sea level rise that inundated their coastal villages. Each culture dressed the core memory in its own spiritual clothing, attributing the cause to their specific gods and weaving in their own moral lessons. But the terrifying heartbeat of the story, the water that consumed the world, remains the same. This isn't just folklore, it's a collective cross-cultural trauma response, a way for humanity to process and never forget the day the water won. Now, if a great flood can become a foundational myth, what about a story of an entire civilization that vanished in a single day and night? This brings us to one of history's most enduring and tantalizing mysteries, the Legend of Atlantis. Unlike the widespread flood myths, the story of Atlantis comes to us from a single, yet incredibly influential, source, the ancient Greek philosopher Plato. In his dialogues Timaeus and Critias, written around 360 BC, Plato describes a powerful and technologically advanced island empire located beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. This was no ordinary place. Atlantis was a marvel of engineering with concentric rings of water and land, grand palaces, and a wealthy, ambitious people. But according to Plato, their hubris grew too great. They launched an unprovoked attack on ancient Athens, and as punishment, the gods sent violent earthquakes and floods, causing the entire island to sink beneath the ocean in a single day and night of misfortune. For centuries, this account was largely read as just that, a powerful philosophical fable. Plato, after all, was using the story as a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride and the ideal of a just society. It was a moral lesson, not a history lesson. But what if the philosopher was building his story on a much older foundation? What if the ghost of a real catastrophe whispers within this myth? The search for a historical Atlantis has taken explorers to every corner of the globe, from the Bahamas to Antarctica. Yet, some of the most compelling evidence lies much closer to Plato's own world, in the shimmering Aegean Sea. Here, around 1600 BCE, one of the most devastating volcanic eruptions in human history tore apart the island of Thera, the heart of the sophisticated Minoan civilization. The Minoans, based primarily on Crete, were the first advanced society in Europe. Their sprawling palace complexes, like the famous one at Knossos, boasted running water, intricate frescoes depicting bull leaping and elegant processions, and a system of writing. They were a maritime power, a trading empire that influenced the entire Mediterranean. And then Thera exploded. The eruption was cataclysmic, estimated to be 4 times more powerful than the famous Krakatoa event of 1883. It spewed ash and pumice across the region, triggering massive tsunamis that would have slammed into the northern coast of Crete, devastating its coastal cities and obliterating its fleet, the very source of its power. The volcanic winter that followed would have crippled agriculture for years. While the Minoan culture didn't vanish overnight, it was dealt a mortal blow from which it never recovered, leaving it vulnerable to conquest by the emerging Mycenaean Greeks from the mainland. When archaeologists began excavating the modern island of Santorini, which now surrounds the vast caldera left by the eruption, they found something astonishing. Buried under layers of volcanic ash was a Minoan-style city, frozen in time much like Pompeii would be centuries later. The buildings were multi-storied, with elaborate drainage systems and stunning wall paintings. This was clearly a prosperous, advanced society that met a sudden, violent end. It's not difficult to imagine how the memory of this event could have persisted for centuries. The Minoans themselves would have carried stories of the sky turning black and the sea turning into a wall of death. The Mycenaeans, who later absorbed aspects of Minoan culture, would have heard these tales. For nearly 1,000 years, these stories would have been told and retold, passed down through oral tradition until they reached the ears of Solon, the Athenian lawmaker, who Plato claims heard a version of the story during his travels in Egypt. The details would have shifted, the location perhaps blurred, but the core memory remained. A great island-based civilization, advanced and powerful, was utterly destroyed by a natural cataclysm. Plato, seeking a powerful narrative for his philosophical purposes, could have then taken this ancient memory and magnified it. He moved the island's location to the Atlantic Ocean to fit his story's scope, amplified its size and age to make it more impressive, and framed its destruction as a moral lesson from the gods. The historical kernel, the sudden collapse of a maritime empire due to a volcanic disaster, was preserved, even as the story itself was reshaped into the magnificent legend we know today. This is the ultimate shape-shifting narrative, a real historical trauma filtered through centuries of storytelling and philosophical need, emerging as the timeless warning of Atlantis. But what happens when a historical leader is so successful, so pivotal to a culture's survival, that his legend simply refuses to die? This is the enduring power of our next narrative, one that has defined the very concept of heroism in the Western world, the legend of King Arthur and his shining city of Camelot. In the wake of the fallen Roman Empire, as the legions withdrew from Britain in the early 5th century, the island was plunged into a period of such profound darkness and chaos that historians still call it the Dark Ages. Left to defend themselves against invading Saxons from the east and Scots and Picts from the north, the native Britons were fighting for their very existence. Out of this desperate struggle for survival, the figure of a war leader emerges from the mist, a Dux Bellorum, a leader of battles who rallied the fragmented British kingdoms and won a series of stunning victories. temporarily halting the Saxon advance. The historical record from this period is incredibly sparse, more a collection of fragments and echoes than a clear narrative. But in two key sources we find hints of this hero. In the work of a 6th century monk named Gildas, we read of Ambrosius Aurelianus, a Romanized British noble who led the resistance, and in a collection of Welsh heroic poems known as the Y Gododdin, a warrior is praised for his valor, though he was no Arthur, implying that by the time this was written, Arthur was already a proverbial standard of military excellence. The most compelling candidate for a historical Arthur, however, may be a Roman military commander named Lucius Artorius Castus. Stationed in Britain in the late 2nd century, he led a cavalry unit of Sarmatian auxiliaries, horsemen from the steppes who carried dragon-shaped windsocks into battle, a possible precursor to the legendary Pendragon banner. While he lived centuries too early for the Saxon Wars, his name and his deeds could have become a legend, a title later applied to a successful 5th century warlord. The name Arthur itself is a clue derived from the Roman Artorius, a name that would have symbolized the lost order and military might of Rome. Over generations, the memory of this leader, whoever he truly was, became a beacon of hope. He wasn't just a man, he became a symbol of British resilience, a promise that a once great people could rise again from the ruins. This is where archaeology steps in to give shape to the shadows. The dramatic clifftop ruins of Tintagel in Cornwall, long celebrated in romance as Arthur's birthplace, have revealed something astonishing. Excavations have uncovered evidence of a powerful, wealthy, and sophisticated settlement from precisely the 5th and 6th centuries, trading fine wine and olive oil from the Mediterranean. This was no mythical castle, but the seat of a real post-Roman British king, living in a style that echoed the lost Roman world, a perfect setting for the birth of a legendary figure. Similarly, Cadbury Castle in Somerset, a massive Iron Age hill fort, shows signs of being refortified and occupied by a powerful leader during this exact period. The defenses were rebuilt with dry stone walling in a style reminiscent of Roman ramparts, and a great feasting hall was constructed at its summit. For the local people, the memory of this stronghold of a great British king who stood against the invaders never truly faded. For centuries, the site was locally known as Camelot. These places tell us that the world of Arthur was real. There were powerful kings in fortified strongholds, holding back the darkness with what little Roman culture they had left, their halls filled with the sounds of feasting and the boasts of warriors. But how did this historical colonel, a capable Dark Age chieftain, transform into the emperor of a chivalric Golden Age, the keeper of the Holy Grail, and the owner of a sword bestowed by a mystical lady? The transformation was the work of centuries of storytellers, each adding a new layer to the legend. Welsh bards, keeping the old Celtic traditions alive, sang poems of a heroic warrior, a defender of the land. Then, in the 12th century, Geoffrey of Montham wrote his History of the Kings of Britain, a brilliant and largely fictional work that introduced the world to a full-blown King Arthur, complete with a wizardly advisor named Merlin. This captured the imagination of Europe, but the final, most beautiful embellishments came from the French medieval romancers. Cretan de Troyes introduced the noble quest for the Grail and the tragic romance of Lancelot and Guinevere. He and others crafted the code of chivalry, the ideal of Camelot as a perfect court, and the Knights of the Round Table as paragons of virtue. These writers were not interested in historical accuracy. They were using the Arthurian framework to explore contemporary ideas about love, honor, and spiritual purity for their own aristocratic audiences. The gritty, desperate struggle of a post-Roman warlord was polished into a glittering mirror of medieval courtly ideals. In doing so, they performed the ultimate act of myth-making. They took a fragment of history, a memory of a leader who helped a people survive, and forged from it a timeless story about the eternal human struggle to build a perfect world in an imperfect one, and the tragic beauty of that impossible dream. Arthur ceased to be a man and became an idea, the once and future king, sleeping until his nation needs him again, a perpetual symbol of hope crafted from the deepest fragments of a national identity. While the legend of King Arthur shows us how a single heroic figure can be amplified into a national symbol, the next narrative reveals how an entire epoch of warfare and cultural collision can be compressed into a single epic tale. For nearly 3,000 years, the story of the Trojan War has stood as a pinnacle of Western literature, a sweeping saga of pride, love, and destiny set against a 10-year siege of a mighty city. With its meddling gods, superhuman warriors like Achilles and Hector, and a plot sparked by the abduction of the most beautiful woman in the world, it's easy to dismiss the Iliad and the Odyssey as magnificent works of pure imagination. But what if we've been asking the wrong question? The issue isn't whether every detail in Homer's epic is true, but whether this foundational story contains a deeply buried historical truth, a memory of a real, devastating conflict that reshaped the ancient world. The answer to that question begins not with a poet, but with a determined, if flawed, amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann. Driven by an almost childlike belief that Homer's stories were real, Schliemann went in search of the city of Troy in the 1870s. While scholars of his day placed the legendary city at various locations, Schliemann fixated on a large mound in western Turkey called Hisarlik. His methods were, by modern standards, brutal and destructive. He employed armies of workers to carve massive trenches through the mound, ruthlessly tearing through layers of history in his quest for Priam's city. Yet his sheer audacity paid off in a way that stunned the academic world. He didn't find one city, he found 9, built one on top of the other over thousands of years. And in one of the middle layers, known as Troy 6 or 7, he found evidence of a city that had been wealthy, powerful, and crucially destroyed by a massive fire and intense warfare. He uncovered a cache of gold jewelry he dramatically dubbed Priam's treasure, and evidence of fortified walls that had been violently breached. Schliemann's romantic interpretation was often wrong. The treasure was from a layer centuries older than any possible Trojan War, but his core discovery was revolutionary. He proved that Hisarlik was indeed a site of immense strategic importance, a fortified city that guarded the entrance to the Dardanelles and the lucrative trade routes to the Black Sea. This was a place worth fighting for, a place that could have been the flashpoint for a major historical conflict. Modern archaeology has refined Schliemann's work, painting a far more nuanced picture. The layer now most commonly associated with a potential Trojan War is Troy 7a, which shows clear signs of a violent end around the year 1250 BC. Archaeologists have found skeletons left unburied in the streets, arrowheads embedded in the fortifications, and evidence of a city that was sacked and burned. This time frame is critically important because it places Troy's destruction right in the middle of the late Bronze Age collapse, a period of utter chaos and upheaval throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Great empires like the Hittites fell, and the mighty Mycenaean Greek palaces, including those of Agamemnon at Mycenae and Nestor at Pylos, were themselves consumed by fire and violence within a century. This was an age of marauders, desperate migrations, and world-altering warfare. In this light, the Trojan War emerges not as a standalone event, but as one particularly memorable chapter in a much larger story of collapse. A coalition of Mycenaean Greek warlords, perhaps led by a powerful king from a place like Mycenae, could very well have launched a military expedition to conquer or plunder this wealthy rival city controlling a vital trade choke point. The 10-year siege described by Homer is likely a poetic exaggeration, but a prolonged campaign or a series of conflicts is entirely plausible. The historical reality was probably a brutal struggle for resources and power, a raid on a grand scale. So how did this gritty, complex historical event transform into the epic poem we know today? The answer lies in the power of oral tradition. For centuries after the fall of the Mycenaean world, Greece entered a dark age. Writing in the form of the Linear B script used by palace bureaucrats to record inventories was lost, but memory was not. The great deeds of that bygone era were kept alive by a guild of oral poets known as the bards. These were not mere storytellers, they were master improvisers trained in a complex system of rhythmic formulas and repetitive epithets, swift-footed Achilles, rosy-fingered Dawn, that allowed them to compose vast, intricate narratives on the fly for their audiences. With each performance, the story evolved. The Mycenaean Greek kings became more godlike, their actions more heroic, their tragedies more profound. The strategic reasons for the war control of trade, plunder, political dominance were simplified and humanized into a timeless story about a personal insult, a stolen wife, and a clash of proud wills. The gods and goddesses of Olympus were woven into the narrative, providing a divine framework to explain the inexplicable turns of fate and fortune on the battlefield. This process wasn't about deception, it was about meaning. The oral poets were preserving the cultural memory of a golden age, processing the trauma of a world that had collapsed, and creating a foundational epic that explained who the Greeks were and where they came from. Homer, whoever he or they may have been, was likely the culmination of this centuries-long tradition, a genius who compiled, refined, and wrote down these oral cycles into the monumental works that have come down to us. The Iliad, therefore, is not a history book, but it is a historical record. It preserves, like a fly in amber, the material culture of the late Bronze Age, descriptions of boar's tusk helmets and body shield Ajax that had been obsolete for centuries by Homer's time. It preserves the geography of the Aegean and the social structures of a forgotten warrior aristocracy. Most importantly, it preserves the emotional truth and the colossal impact of a war that became the defining moment in the cultural memory of ancient Greece. It proves that a story, passed from mouth to ear over generations, can be one of history's most resilient and shape-shifting vessels. Leaving behind the battlefields of Troy, we sail south across the Aegean Sea to the island of Crete, where another legendary monster awaits in the heart of a maze. The myth of the Minotaur is one of the most vivid and terrifying to emerge from the Greek world. It tells of a monstrous creature, half man and half bull, born from a queen's unnatural passion, imprisoned by a shamed king in an inescapable labyrinth designed by the legendary craftsman Deathless. And it tells of a grim tribute. Every 9 years, the city of Athens was forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women into that maze to be devoured by the beast, a brutal price paid to the powerful King Minos of Crete. On the surface, it's a classic monster story, a tale of horror and heroic triumph when the Athenian prince Theseus finally slays the beast. But when we hold this myth up to the light of archaeology, a startlingly different picture comes into focus, one that reveals how a magnificent civilization was systematically demonized and recast as a land of monsters by its rivals. The key to unlocking this historical secret isn't found in a dark maze, but in the brilliant, sun-drenched frescoes of a rediscovered palace. The most crucial piece of evidence comes from the walls of the great Minoan palace complex at Knossos itself. Here and at other sites, archaeologists uncovered stunning artworks depicting a breathtaking and incredibly dangerous ritual, bull leaping. In these vibrant frescoes, we see young, athletic figures, both male and female, engaging in what appears to be a sacred gymnastic performance with a powerful, charging bull. One figure seizes the bull's horns, using the animal's own momentum to somersault over its back, where a second catcher stands ready to break their fall. This was not a casual sport. It was a highly skilled and undoubtedly lethal ceremony, central to Minoan religious and cultural life. The bull was a potent symbol of strength and divinity throughout the ancient world, and for the Minoans, mastering this magnificent creature in such a dramatic, public way was likely a demonstration of both spiritual favor and physical prowess. To the Mycenaean Greeks who later came into contact with and ultimately conquered Minoan Crete, this practice would have seemed utterly foreign, awe-inspiring, and profoundly dangerous. The image of humans grappling with a mighty bull, a scene repeated in their art and likely in their rituals, could easily have been distorted in the telling. Over generations of oral tradition, the skilled, sacred athlete somersaulting over the bull's back could have morphed in the Greek imagination into a single monstrous fusion of man and bull. The bull leaper became the bullman, the Minotaur, the intricate, sprawling layout of the vast Knossos palace complex, with its hundreds of interconnected rooms, corridors, and courtyards spreading over acres, could have felt like an impossible maze to outsiders. For the Mycenaeans, who were accustomed to more fortified, centralized citadels like Mycenae, getting lost in the complex, multi-storied palace of Knossos would have been a memorable and perhaps unsettling experience. This very real architectural wonder likely provided the blueprint for the mythological labyrinth. The word itself may even derive from the Minoan term for a double-headed axe, the labris, a sacred symbol found carved into the stone walls throughout the palace. The house of the double axe could have easily become, in translation and fearful retelling, the impenetrable labyrinth. But what of the most chilling aspect of the myth, the tribute of Athenian youths sent to their deaths? This is where history and political propaganda become deeply intertwined. Archaeological evidence suggests that during the peak of Minoan power in the 2nd millennium BC, their influence was vast, stretching across the Aegean through a powerful navy and extensive trade networks. The emerging cultures on the Greek mainland, the predecessors of the Mycenaeans, would have lived in the shadow of this thalassocracy, or sea empire. It is entirely plausible that these mainland communities, including a fledgling Athens, were required to pay some form of tribute to the powerful Cretan king, perhaps in goods, in resources, or even in a symbolic sending of young people to serve in the Minoan court. This was a common practice in the ancient world, a way to secure allegiances and display dominance. For the Athenians of later centuries, looking back on this period of subjugation, the memory would have been a bitter one. The story of sending their young people to Crete was humiliating. To reframe this historical reality, they transformed it. The tribute was no longer presented as a political or economic submission to a more advanced culture. Instead, it became a horrifying sacrifice to a monstrous beast. The Minoans were no longer sophisticated overlords. They were depicted as cruel and barbaric, demanding the blood of Athenian children. This narrative transformation served a powerful purpose for later Greeks, particularly the Athenians who popularized the myth in the classical era. It allowed them to recast a period of their own historical inferiority and vassalage into a story of heroic resistance and ultimate triumph. Theseus's victory over the Minotaur wasn't just the killing of a monster. It was a symbolic overthrow of Minoan dominance, a declaration of Greek independence and moral superiority. The myth effectively demonized a once great civilization, turning their complex religious practices into savage brutality and their magnificent architectural achievements into a prison for a monster. It is a prime example of how the winners write history, but not in history books, in stories. They shift the memory of a rival's power into a tale of monstrous evil, making their own cultural ascent seem like a righteous victory of light over darkness. From the sun-drenched ruins of the Mediterranean, we now journey north into a world of ice and fire, to a mythology forged in the cold and shaped by cataclysm. The Viking vision of the end times, Ragnarok, is perhaps the most stark and brutally beautiful apocalypse in all of world mythology. It is not a gentle end. It is a final, glorious battle where the gods themselves are doomed to fall. The sun and moon are swallowed by wolves, the world tree Yggdrasil trembles, and the earth itself sinks beneath the rising sea. After this total destruction, the prophecies say, a new green world will emerge from the water, and a new generation of gods will inherit it. For a long time, this was seen as pure cosmological storytelling, a dramatic narrative to explain the cyclical nature of existence. But what if this entire epic was born from a real historical nightmare, a memory of a time when the sun truly did vanish and the world grew bitterly, terrifyingly cold? The key to unlocking this mystery lies in a single, chilling phrase from the ancient texts, the Fimbulwinter. This was not just any winter. The Old Norse sources describe it as a great and mighty winter, 3 successive winters with no summer in between, a period of such intense cold and darkness that it would break societies and shatter the natural order, serving as the direct precursor to the gods' final battle. Such an event feels too specific, too visceral to be mere invention, and incredibly, science has revealed that it very likely was real. The 6th century after Christ was a period of profound global catastrophe. Around the year 536, the sky did something terrifying across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Contemporary chroniclers from Byzantium to China wrote of a mysterious, persistent dust veil that obscured the sun for up to 18 months. The Byzantine historian Procopius recorded that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year. Summer snow fell in China, temperatures plummeted globally. This was not a local event, it was a planetary climate disaster. Tree ring evidence from ancient Irish oaks and other sources shows a period of stunted growth unlike any other in the last 2,000 years. The cause, we now know it was almost certainly a massive volcanic eruption, or perhaps a series of them. Ice cores drilled from glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica contain layers of sulfate deposits from this exact period, the chemical fingerprint of a volcano, or volcanoes, so powerful it ejected millions of tons of ash and sulfur dioxide high into the stratosphere, creating a global sun-blocking shield that drastically cooled the planet. The consequences were immediate and apocalyptic. Crops failed from Ireland to Mesopotamia, leading to mass famine. Societies weakened by hunger were then ravaged by the Justinian plague, which swept out of the east, killing tens of millions. It was one of the worst centuries to be alive in human history. For the Scandinavian tribes of the far north, the impact would have been magnified exponentially. Their agriculture, already marginal in the best of times, would have completely collapsed. The endless winter would have frozen the Baltic Sea, disrupting trade and fishing. The long nights of their winters would have felt truly eternal. The social fabric would have torn under the strain of starvation and desperation. This was the Fimbulwinter, not as myth, but as lived generational trauma. The memory of this year's long darkness, of watching your family starve and your world freeze, would have been burned into the collective psyche. But how does a society process an event of such incomprehensible scale and horror? They turn it into a story. The Norse skalds, the poet-historians who held the entire cultural memory of their people, would not have recorded the event as a scientific anomaly. They processed it through the lens of their existing worldview, their cosmology of constant struggle between the forces of order, the Aesir gods, and the forces of chaos, the giants. The volcanic ash that blackened the sun became the wolf skull finally catching and devouring it. The global freezing and violent storms became the breaking of all bonds, the unleashing of the chaotic frost giants upon the world. The social collapse and warfare that surely followed famine became the epic battle on the Vigrid plain, where brother fought brother and all oaths were broken. The plague that swept through weakened populations became the arrival of the ship Naglfar, made from the untrimmed nails of the dead and carrying the army of hell itself. In this incredible act of mythological alchemy, the Skalds transformed a historical climate catastrophe into the central, defining drama of their religion. The trauma was not forgotten, it was elevated into prophecy. The random, terrifying violence of nature was given meaning and structure. It was all part of a destined cosmic cycle. Even the hopeful coda of Ragnarok, the emergence of a new, green world from the sea, can be seen as a profound expression of resilience. It is the memory, perhaps from their ancestors, that after the long winter, the sun did eventually return. The grass did grow again, life did go on. The myth provided a framework for understanding unbearable suffering and a promise of renewal after total destruction. It encoded the deepest fear of a people living in a harsh climate that winter might one day never end, and transformed it into a narrative that made them not just victims of a random disaster, but participants in a grand, tragic, and ultimately hopeful cosmic drama. Ragnarok is therefore far more than a story about the death of gods. It is a stunning example of how human beings use the power of narrative to stare into the abyss of historical trauma and find a way to give it meaning, ensuring that even the end of the world can be remembered, sung about, and survived. Yet the story of El Dorado is far more than a simple tale of a golden man. It is a powerful and tragic demonstration of how a single cultural misunderstanding, magnified through the lens of greed and wishful thinking, can spiral into a world-altering myth. The true origin of the legend lies not in a city, but in a breathtaking ritual performed by the Muisca people, a sophisticated confederation of tribes living in the highlands of what is now Colombia. For the Muisca, gold was not currency, it was a sacred substance, the sweat of the sun god, and its purpose was ceremonial, not economic. The most significant of these ceremonies was the installation of a new chief, or Zipa. To commemorate this sacred transition, the new ruler would travel to the center of Lake Guatavita, a deep, circular crater lake high in the mountains. There, on a ceremonial raft piled high with gold and emeralds, he would be stripped of his clothing and his body entirely covered in sticky resin before being dusted with fine gold powder. In the light of the dawn, he would have been a living, breathing statue of gold, a dazzling embodiment of the sun's power on earth. As the raft reached the center of the lake, the silence would be broken only by the sound of the offerings, the gold, the emeralds, the trinkets being cast into the deep, dark waters as a tribute to the gods. This was El Dorado, not a place but a person, the Golden One. When the first Spanish conquistadors arrived in the early 16th century, they heard fragments of this story, likely from neighboring tribes. But their minds, conditioned by centuries of European folklore about cities of gold and fueled by an insatiable lust for wealth, immediately and catastrophically misinterpreted what they were told. They took the description of a single, glittering man and extrapolated it into an entire city made of gold, a place of unimaginable wealth just waiting to be plundered. This distortion was a classic case of hearing what one wants to hear. For men like Gonzalo Pizarro and Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, the pursuit of El Dorado became an obsession that drove them to madness and ruin. They launched brutal expeditions deep into the uncharted jungles of the Amazon and the Andes, dragging thousands of indigenous porters and slaves with them. These quests were exercises in unimaginable suffering, resulting in starvation, disease, and death for countless natives and Spaniards alike, all chasing a phantom that grew more elaborate with each retelling. The myth evolved from a city to a kingdom, and then to an empire, its location shifting perpetually just beyond the next mountain range or down the next unexplored river. It was a dream that consumed lives and fortunes, a powerful testament to how a folktale, once infected with greed, can rewrite history itself. The profound irony, of course, is that the real treasure was never a hidden city. It was all around them, in the sophisticated cultures they were systematically destroying. The Muisca and other pre-Columbian societies like the Quimbaya and the Tarona were master metallurgists. They didn't just mine gold, they transformed it into art through techniques like lost wax casting that still inspire awe today. This incredible legacy is now preserved in Bogotá's Museo del Oro, the Gold Museum, which holds tens of thousands of these exquisite artifacts. There you will find delicate paporo lids depicting the very ceremony of El Dorado, intricate tunjos votive offerings that served as prayers in metal, and stunning representations of animals and deities that show a deep, spiritual connection to the natural world. These objects were not wealth to be melted down into coins. They were a physical language of faith, power, and cosmology. The Spanish, blinded by their own material desires, could only see the raw material, not the meaning. They drained Lake Guatavita multiple times in futile attempts to recover its legendary offerings, only ever finding a fraction of what was surely there, and in the process, they irrevocably damaged the sacred site. The legend of El Dorado, therefore, stands as a stark parable about the collision of two worldviews. For one culture, value was spiritual and symbolic, expressed through breathtaking artistry. For the other, value was purely economic, measured in weight and purity. The myth that emerged from this clash was not a complete fabrication. It was a distortion, a shape-shifting narrative that took a kernel of beautiful, complex truth and warped it into a destructive fantasy that would echo for centuries, forever linking the story of the Americas to a desperate, unending search for a city of gold that was never there. For centuries, the Amazons were relegated to the realm of pure fantasy, a convenient plot device for Greek heroes to prove their mettle against a race of superhumanly fierce women who lived at the very edge of the known world. They were the ultimate other, a society turned upside down where women ruled as warriors and hunters, and men were marginalized or absent. To the patriarchal Greeks, this idea was so shocking, so antithetical to their entire social order, that it could only be a myth. But what if the seed of this incredible story wasn't found in the imagination of a poet, but in the real, lived experience of Greek colonists and explorers who ventured into the vast, wild steppes north of the Black Sea? The key to unlocking this mystery doesn't lie in ancient texts, but in the silent, frozen earth of burial mounds scattered across modern-day Ukraine, Russia, and Kazakhstan. Here, archaeologists have made a series of stunning discoveries that have completely rewritten our understanding of these nomadic cultures. They have unearthed graves from the Scythian and Sarmatian peoples, dating from the very time the Amazon myths were flourishing in Greece. And in a significant number of these burials, the skeletons are accompanied by the full panoply of a warrior: iron swords, quivers full of arrows, bronze-tipped spears, and protective armor. These weren't symbolic offerings. The placement of the weapons and the telltale signs of battle injuries on the bones confirm these individuals were active, respected combatants. And the skeletons, upon careful anthropological analysis, are biologically female. Some were young girls buried with their tiny bows and arrows. Others were older women, their bodies showing the healed fractures and spinal trauma of a lifetime on horseback and in combat. One particularly striking burial from the 4th century BCE, found in modern-day Russia, held a woman no older than 25. She was laid to rest in a position of high honor, dressed in a fine tunic and accompanied by an iron dagger, over 24 arrows, and a unique headdress. Most remarkably, her legs were bent in a way that clearly indicated she had spent her life riding horses. This was not a mythical Amazon. This was a real, flesh and blood nomadic horsewoman, a warrior who lived and died by the bow and the blade. This is where the work of historians like Adrian Mayer becomes so vital. In her groundbreaking research, she meticulously connects these archaeological finds to the Greek myths. The Scythians and their relatives were not a vague, unknown people to the Greeks. Greek colonies like Olbia on the Black Sea coast were vibrant trading hubs where Greek merchants and settlers lived in close, if sometimes tense, proximity to these nomadic tribes. The Greeks would have seen these people with their own eyes. They would have witnessed, perhaps with a mixture of fear and fascination, the incredible equestrian skills of these cultures, where women rode and hunted alongside the men. They would have seen their distinctive clothing, the practical trousers which Greek men and women never wore, and the pointed felt hats. They would have heard stories, through traders and interpreters, of their egalitarian social structures and their fearsome prowess in battle. To a Greek man whose own wife or sister lived a largely secluded domestic life within the walls of the home, the sight of an armed, independent woman commanding a horse would have been utterly astonishing. It broke every single social code they lived by. The Greek mind, faced with something so completely outside its experience, did what it does best: it mythologized. It took these observed realities and amplified them into a grand, epic narrative. The skilled female horse archer became the superhuman Amazon warrior. The nomadic practice of everyone, regardless of gender, contributing to hunting and defense became a bizarre society without men. The vast, open steppe became a defined, mythical territory on the edge of the world. The Greeks didn't invent the Amazons out of nothing. They took a kernel of stunning cultural truth and spun it into a legend that made sense to their own worldview. And that worldview desperately needed another. The Amazon myth served a crucial psychological and cultural function for ancient Greece. By creating a powerful, inverted image of their own society, the Greeks were able to define, by contrast, what it meant to be a Greek man and a Greek woman. The Amazon was the antithesis of the ideal Greek wife, the obedient, homebound Penelope. She was wild, untamed, and dangerous, and therefore, the ultimate triumph for a Greek hero like Hercules or Theseus wasn't just to defeat a monster, but to subdue this dangerous perversion of the natural order. The myths where Greek heroes defeat Amazons and take their belts or their queen are powerful allegories for the triumph of Greek civilization over chaos, of patriarchy over a threatening matriarchy, of us over them. The Amazon became the perfect foil, a formidable enemy whose defeat only made the Greek hero look stronger. This process of turning a real cultural group into a mythological other is a pattern we see repeated throughout history. It's a way for a society to process the anxiety that comes from encountering a people who are different, powerful, and misunderstood. The historical Sarmatian woman warrior, a respected member of her nomadic tribe, was erased and replaced by the mythic Amazon, a monstrous distortion that served the narrative needs of a foreign culture. Her real story was hidden in the ground for over 2 millennia, waiting for archaeology to finally unearth the formidable truth behind one of the world's most enduring legends. But perhaps the most profound layer of the Phoenix myth is its reflection of humanity's own historical cycles of collapse and renewal. Consider the great empires of antiquity. The civilization of ancient Egypt, for instance, experienced not one but several dramatic downfalls and resurgences over its 3,000-year history. Periods of weak pharaohs, foreign invasion, and famine, the metaphorical fires were consistently followed by eras of rebirth and magnificent renewal, like the New Kingdom, which saw the empire reach its greatest territorial extent and cultural height. To an observer living through the collapse of the Middle Kingdom, the subsequent rise must have felt as miraculous and destined as a bird rising from its own ashes. The same pattern echoes with the Assyrian Empire, which was famously destroyed and its capital, Nineveh, burned to the ground in 612 BCE, only for its cultural and administrative practices to be absorbed and resurrected within the succeeding Neo-Babylonian and Persian empires. The phoenix doesn't just represent a bird, it becomes a powerful symbol for this seemingly inevitable historical rhythm. It encapsulates the terrifying yet hopeful truth that civilizations, like living beings, have a lifespan. They are born, they flourish, they age and decline, and from their dissolution, new societies inevitably emerge, often carrying forward the best ideas of the old. The myth provided a framework for understanding immense, society-level trauma. It offered comfort that even in the face of total destruction, whether by invasion, plague, or natural disaster, this was not necessarily the end. It was part of a grand, cyclical process of death and rebirth that was woven into the very fabric of time itself. The story of the phoenix is ultimately a story of hope engineered for the long term, a narrative promise etched into the human spirit that no matter how dark the night, the dawn will always return. Across the windswept hills and ancient forests of Ireland, a different kind of shape-shifting narrative took root, one not of cataclysm or conquest, but of magical arrival and impossible skill. The early Irish texts tell of a mysterious race known as the Tuatha de Danann, the people of the goddess Dogu. They were not mere mortals, they were described as god-like beings of incredible power and knowledge who arrived in Ireland in a mist, bringing with them 4 legendary treasures: a stone that would cry out to proclaim the true king, an unstoppable spear, an unbreakable sword, and a cauldron that could provide endless nourishment. They were the masters of druidry, magic, and all the arts, and they were said to have fought epic battles against the previous inhabitants of Ireland, the Fir Bolg and the monstrous Fomorians, before eventually ruling the land themselves. After their own defeat by the incoming Milesians, the ancestors of the modern Irish, they were said to have retreated into the ancient burial mounds and Shia, the fairy forts that dot the Irish landscape, becoming the Dina Shia, the people of the mounds, who we now know as the Aos Shi or fairies. For a long time, this was seen as a purely mythological prehistory, a fanciful account of the ages before real human history began. But what if the Tuatha de Danann are not just gods, but the folk memory of a very real, very human event? The arrival of a new people whose technology was so advanced, so revolutionary, that to the indigenous population, it could only be explained as magic. The timeline of Ireland's ancient past provides a compelling clue. The island was first settled by Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, followed by Neolithic farmers who began constructing massive megalithic tombs around 3200 BC, like the awe-inspiring passage tomb at Newgrange. This structure is a masterpiece of Stone Age engineering, designed so precisely that the inner chamber is illuminated by the winter solstice sunrise, a feat of astronomical alignment that would have required generations of knowledge. To the people who came after them, who had lost the understanding of how such a thing was achieved, the builders of Newgrange might well have seemed like a race of giants or magicians. Then, around 2500 BCE, a new wave of change arrived, likely from the European continent, the knowledge of metallurgy. This was not just an incremental improvement, it was a quantum leap. The ability to extract metal from stone and forge it into tools and weapons would have been nothing short of supernatural. Imagine being a Neolithic farmer whose entire world is defined by stone, bone, and wood, suddenly encountering a people who could create shining, razor-sharp blades from rock, who could work a material that was both liquid and solid, a process that must have looked like the most powerful form of druidry. The archaeological record shows that these early Bronze Age metallurgists were also responsible for new styles of pottery, new burial practices, and likely new social structures. They were a package deal, a new culture with new technologies. Is it so difficult to believe that the memory of this transformative arrival persisted for millennia, evolving into the story of the god like Tuatha de Danann arriving with their magical treasures? The unstoppable spear of Lug and the unbreakable sword of Nuada could be powerful mythological representations of the first superior bronze weapons that made their owners seem invincible in battle. This process of transforming history into myth was given its final, definitive form by a later group of arrivals, Christian monks, when these scribes began writing down Ireland's ancient oral histories around the 7th and 8th centuries CE. They faced a theological problem. They couldn't very well write that the pagan gods of Ireland were real, powerful deities, as that would contradict Christian doctrine. Instead, they employed a technique known as euhemerism, a concept named after the Greek philosopher Euhemerus, who argued that the gods of myth were actually great kings and heroes of the distant past whose deeds had been exaggerated over time. The monastic scribes applied this logic to the Tuatha de Danann. They demoted them from gods to a powerful, magical race of superhumans who had once ruled Ireland, and they placed them in a pseudo-historical timeline alongside the other mythical invaders of the island. In doing so, they effectively preserved the stories while sanitizing them of their outright paganism, turning divine figures into historical heroes and sorcerers. This is why in the texts like the Liber Gabala Iren, the Book of Invasions, the Tuatha de Danann are presented not as a pantheon to be worshipped, but as a chapter in Ireland's storied past, a race of extraordinary people who were eventually superseded. This Christian reinterpretation was the final act of shape-shifting, cementing the narrative that what was once worshipped as divine was actually historical, just amplified by the mists of time and the power of legend. The enduring legacy of the Tuatha de Danann is therefore a fascinating palimpsest, a story written over many times. At its deepest layer, it likely contains a genuine folk memory of a technological and cultural revolution so profound that it could only be explained as magic. This memory was then carried through centuries of oral tradition, becoming the foundational myth of the island's pre-Christian identity. Finally, it was codified by Christian scribes who gave it the form we recognize today, a form that allowed these ancient gods to survive not as objects of worship, but as the beloved heroes and fairy folk of Irish folklore. They didn't vanish, they simply retreated into the landscape itself, their names attached to the very hills and mounds that had witnessed the real, historical innovations of their possible prototypes. The story of the Tuatha de Danann is ultimately a story about how a society remembers its own past not through dry facts, but through the language of wonder, attributing the awe-inspiring achievements of their ancestors to a race of divine beings who walked the land long ago, leaving their magic etched into the soil and stones of Ireland. Leaving behind the epic tales of gods and heroes, we now turn to a different kind of mystery, one not written in words but shaped by hand from the earth itself. Imagine uncovering from the deep soil of a prehistoric settlement a small clay figure so strange, so utterly unlike anything in the natural world, that it seems to whisper of a reality beyond our own. This is the experience of archaeologists who unearthed the Dogu, the enigmatic clay figurines crafted by the Jomon people of ancient Japan, a culture that flourished for an astonishing 14,000 years. These are not simple dolls or rudimentary pottery. With their exaggerated, heart-shaped faces, their large, almond-shaped eyes that seem to see into another dimension, and their bodies often covered in intricate, swirling patterns, the Dogu stand as some of the most visually arresting and perplexing artifacts from the deep human past. They feel simultaneously ancient and extraterrestrial, familiar and utterly alien. It is this very otherworldliness that has made them a perfect canvas for the human imagination, a catalyst for stories that stretch from ancient ancestor worship to modern theories of interstellar visitors. The journey of the Dogu from broken clay fragments in the ground to central figures in mythological narratives is a powerful lesson in how a culture's most sacred objects can shape-shift through time, transforming from ritual tools into the seeds of legend. To understand the potential of these objects to inspire myth, we must first appreciate their profound strangeness. The most famous type, known as the goggle-eyed Dogu, is a breathtaking example. Its face is dominated by two massive, circular eyes that resemble nothing so much as a pair of snow goggles or the visor of an advanced spacesuit. Lines radiate from these eyes, and the entire body is often covered in a dense, tattoo-like pattern of cord markings, the meaning of which is lost to time. Other figures have exaggerated hips and breasts, suggesting a focus on fertility, while some appear to be wearing elaborate headdresses or clothing. They are not realistic portrayals of human beings. They are abstracted, stylized, and intensely symbolic. When you hold one or even look at a photograph, you are immediately struck by the feeling that you are not looking at a person, but at a representation of a spirit, a deity, or a being from a different plane of existence. This intentional departure from realism is the first clue that these objects were never meant to be toys. They were conduits to the unseen world. This spiritual purpose is confirmed by their archaeological context. Dogu are rarely found in everyday trash pits or domestic settings. Instead, they are most commonly discovered in two types of places: in graves, placed carefully alongside the deceased, or in circular stone arrangements and pit dwellings that archaeologists interpret as ritual sites. Crucially, a significant number of these figurines have been found deliberately broken, often with pieces missing. This was not accidental damage, it was a purposeful act. Many scholars believe this practice points to a ritual called yamu, a form of sympathetic magic where an illness or a curse was transferred into the Dogu, which was then ritually broken to destroy the affliction and heal the person. The Dogu, therefore, was a sacred vessel, a protective spirit, and a sacrificial object all in one. It served as an intermediary between the Jomon people and the powerful, animistic forces they believed governed their world: the spirits of the forest, the river, and the sky. So how does an object of such specific ritual function evolve into the stuff of myth and modern speculation? The process begins with the passage of millennia. The Jomon period eventually gave way to the Yayoi period around 300 BC, bringing new technologies, new people, and new beliefs from the Asian mainland. The old ways faded, and the knowledge of what the Dogu truly represented was lost. But the objects themselves did not disappear. For centuries, farmers tilling their fields or people digging foundations would occasionally unearth these strange, fragmented clay figures. With no cultural memory to explain them, how would they have been interpreted? To a medieval Japanese peasant finding a Dogu with its goggled eyes and swirling patterns, it would not have looked like an ancient ritual tool. It would have looked like a creature, a yokai, a spirit, a visitor from a forgotten age. These unearthed figures easily could have been incorporated into local folklore as earth spirits or artifacts from the time of the kami, the Shinto deities. The very strangeness that made them effective in ritual now made them perfect for myth-making, their true history replaced by stories that made sense to the people who discovered them centuries later. This process of reinterpretation has reached its zenith in the modern era. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the Dogu have been adopted by ancient astronaut theorists as some of the most compelling evidence for prehistoric extraterrestrial contact. Their proponents point to the iconic goggle-eyed design and ask, "Doesn't this look like a being in a protective suit? Aren't those patterns reminiscent of advanced technology? Could the Jaman people have been depicting visitors from the stars?" While mainstream archaeology dismisses this as pseudoscience, the theory persists because it taps into a deep, universal human tendency to explain the unfamiliar with the most extraordinary possibilities available to us. For the Jaman, the unknown was explained through the language of animism and ritual magic. For us, it is often explained through the language of advanced technology and science fiction. The Dogu are the perfect Rorschach test for this impulse. Their abstract form allows every generation to project its own fears, wonders, and questions onto them. The true power of the Dogu narrative lies in this incredible journey. They began as sacred objects, deeply embedded in a living, understood religious practice. When that practice died, the objects were physically buried and then culturally buried, their original meaning erased. Their subsequent rediscovery allowed them to be reborn, first as potential figures in local folklore, and now as icons in a globalized myth about humanity's past. They show us that an artifact doesn't need to be a written text to tell a story. Its very form, its mystery, and its silence can be a blank page upon which countless narratives are written. The Dogu are not merely clay, they are a mirror reflecting our perpetual desire to find meaning in the mysteries left behind by those who came before us, proving that sometimes the most powerful myths are not born from stories told, but from objects unearthed. Now let us travel from the sun-scorched steppes and into the deep, dark forests of Slavic folklore, where we encounter a villain of a very different kind, one whose power lies not in physical strength, but in an infuriating, seemingly absolute immortality. The fairy tale of Koschei the Deathless is a masterclass in narrative terror. He is the archetypal abductor, the ancient sorcerer who steals away the hero's beloved and locks her in his otherworldly castle. The hero, often a prince named Ivan, must then embark on a seemingly impossible quest. He can battle Koschei, he can even hack him to pieces, but it is all for nothing. The villain simply laughs as his body reassembles itself, for Koschei cannot be killed in any ordinary way. His soul is not in his body. It is hidden elsewhere, separated and secured inside a nested series of magical objects. His death is contained in an egg, inside a duck, inside a hare, inside an iron chest, buried under a green oak tree on a faraway island. Until that egg is found and crushed, Koschei is truly deathless, an oppressive force that can never be defeated, only temporarily inconvenienced. On the surface, it's a brilliant magical puzzle, a classic fairy tale obstacle. But when we listen to the deeper rhythms of this story, we begin to hear the echoes of a very real, very long historical nightmare, the experience of living under a tyranny that feels eternal, unassailable, and utterly inescapable. To understand how a folktale can encode such a profound political trauma, we must look to a pivotal era in Russian history, the Mongol yoke. For over 2 centuries, from the 1230s to the 1480s, the principalities of Rus lived under the domination of the Golden Horde, the western branch of the Mongol Empire. This was not a typical war with a clear beginning and end. It was a state of perpetual subjugation. The Mongols were a seemingly unstoppable force, a wave of highly disciplined horse archers who had conquered empires from China to Hungary. To the Slavic people, their khans must have seemed like supernatural beings of immense, cruel power. They demanded crushing annual tributes, raided villages for slaves, and appointed and puppetized Russian princes at will. Resistance was not just difficult, it often felt utterly futile. A prince could raise an army and win a skirmish, but the overwhelming might of the horde would inevitably return to crush the rebellion and exact a terrible price. The oppression was a constant, inescapable fact of life, a shadow that stretched across generations. For a people living under such a yoke, the concept of an immortal, unkillable villain who could not be overcome by direct force would have been a terrifyingly accurate metaphor for their reality. The Mongols or any foreign invader weren't just an army, they were Koschei, a deathless power that kept coming back. This is where the story's central magical mechanism, the hidden soul or death, becomes not just a plot device, but a profound allegory for resistance. The tale teaches a crucial lesson: you cannot fight tyranny head-on. The power of the oppressor is never truly in the body of the king or the general you see before you. It is located in a much more secure, systemic place. It is in the economic structures that fund their armies, the supply lines that feed them, the political alliances that sustain them, and the psychological fear that immobilizes their subjects. Destroying one army is like cutting off one of Koschei's limbs. The system simply regenerates. The only way to achieve true liberation is to find the hidden, vulnerable heart of that entire system and break it. The hero's quest for the nested egg is a blueprint for a strategic, intelligence-based resistance. It is about being clever, not just strong. It is about traveling far, gathering information, understanding the complex, interlocking nature of the power structure, and striking at its most delicate, vital point. This is a story that would have given a subjugated people immense psychological comfort and a strategic paradigm. It validated their experience that direct confrontation was suicide, while simultaneously offering hope that no power, no matter how vast and immortal it seemed, was without a single critical weakness. We can see this narrative pattern repeating throughout Slavic history, each time adapting to a new Koschei. For centuries after the Mongol yoke, Russia was ruled by a series of increasingly autocratic tsars, whose power was absolute and whose rule could feel as inescapable as any fairy tale curse. Then, in the 20th century, the Soviet state presented itself as another form of immortal, unassailable power, a vast bureaucratic system that demanded total submission and seemed capable of crushing any individual dissent without effort. The KGB, with its pervasive surveillance, was the ultimate hidden soul of the state, an invisible, seemingly omnipresent force that maintained control. And in both cases, the cultural memory of how to oppose such a force, the Koschei paradigm of finding the hidden weakness, persisted. Dissidents and samizdat publishers didn't try to storm the Kremlin. They searched for the ideological and informational Achilles heel of the system, circulating forbidden books and ideas that were the metaphorical needles that could prick the hidden egg. The folktale provided a timeless framework for understanding how to resist a seemingly eternal oppression, teaching that the key to defeating a monster is not to roar at it, but to outthink it. Koschei the Deathless is therefore far more than a scary story for children. It is a fundamental piece of cultural software, a narrative tool that has been passed down for generations to process the trauma of political subjugation and to encode the most vital strategy for survival and eventual liberation: that no tyranny is truly deathless if only you can find where its soul is hidden. While the story of Koschei shows how folklore can encode strategies of resistance, Another tradition reveals how stories can become a living library, preserving not just political truths but the very blueprint of the land itself. For the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, the past is not a distant, forgotten era. It is a living, breathing presence interwoven with the landscape through the stories of the Dreamtime. This concept, often translated as dreaming, is far more than a collection of myths. It is a comprehensive framework of lore, identity, spirituality, and, most astonishingly, a detailed oral archive of environmental knowledge passed down with meticulous accuracy for thousands of generations. Unlike Western historical records that sit on shelves, this archive is sung, painted, danced, and told, with each feature of the land, every river bend, mountain, and rock formation acting as a permanent mnemonic device, a physical bookmark in a continent-spanning epic of creation and memory. A powerful example of this deep interconnection between story and science is the Legend of the Three Sisters, a stunning rock formation in the Blue Mountains west of Sydney. The standard story told to tourists is a charming tale of three sisters from the Katoomba tribe who are turned to stone by a sorcerer to protect them from a great danger, with the sorcerer subsequently losing his magic bone and being unable to reverse the spell. While this captures the surface narrative, the deeper, custodial stories held by the Gundungurra and Darug peoples contain layers of geographical wisdom. Their dreaming stories for the region describe the actions of ancestral beings like Mirigan and Garangach, a powerful half-fish, half-reptile creature whose epic battle carved out the Jameson Valley and the Gros River. These narratives are not just fanciful explanations, they are intricate maps. They detail the location of important resources, the paths of ancient songlines, and the geological history of the area. The story of the three sisters themselves, in some tellings, is intricately linked to the particular type of sandstone that forms them, which is more resistant to erosion than the surrounding rock, a fact that the story preserves through metaphor. The landscape and the legend are two sides of the same coin, one impossible to read without the other. This function as an oral archive reaches its most mind-bending potential with stories that appear to record encounters with long-extinct megafauna. On the continent's northern coast, several Aboriginal groups have passed down detailed stories about a time when the coastline was far further out, and the land now under the sea was once a vast, fertile plain. These aren't vague memories, they are specific. The Gulumorigin/Larakia people, for example, have traditions that accurately describe the now submerged coastlines and the freshwater springs that once bubbled there. Even more remarkably, researchers have identified rock art at sites like Arnhem Land that appear to depict animals not seen on the continent for thousands of years. A painting from the Juliri Rock Shelter shows a detailed, lifelike representation of a large, goose-like bird, which paleontologists believe is Genyornis newtoni, a heavy-built, flightless bird that went extinct across Australia around 45,000 years ago. How could such a detailed image exist unless the knowledge of this creature had been transmitted orally for over 1,000 generations? Similarly, stories from the Queensland rainforest describe a giant, clawed monitor lizard that lived in the trees. This description is a near-perfect match for the fossil record of Megalania prisca, a giant goanna that could reach over 18 feet in length and that science says disappeared at least 40,000 years ago. The persistence of these descriptions suggests that Aboriginal oral traditions are not merely symbolic, but can contain eyewitness accounts of a lost world, preserved with a fidelity that challenges our very understanding of human memory. The mechanism behind this incredible longevity is the sacred and formalized process of knowledge transmission. Dreamtime stories are not casually told, they are custodial property, passed down through specific lineages with immense precision. The telling is accompanied by song, dance, and ceremony, all of which reinforce the memory. The landscape itself acts as a constant reminder and a physical prompt. An elder pointing to a rock formation while telling the story of the ancestor who created it creates a powerful cognitive link between the narrative and the place. This isn't just history, it is a system of education, law, and land management all rolled into one. Modern science is only now beginning to catch up with the accuracy of this ancient knowledge. Geologists studying sea level rise confirm that the descriptions of the ancient coastline in these stories are accurate for a period that ended over 7,000 years ago. Linguists and anthropologists like Professor Nick Reed and Professor Patrick Nunn have studied these stories extensively, arguing that the consistency of details across vast distances and different language groups points to a common, ancient origin rooted in real events. Their work suggests that some of these narratives have been passed down, essentially unchanged in their core details for over 10,000 years. This isn't a vague folk memory. It is a rigorous, sustained, and incredibly effective system of preserving vital environmental data across millennia. The Dreamtime stories show us that mythology, at its most sophisticated, is not a primitive attempt at science. It is science's precursor and partner, a holistic way of understanding the world that seamlessly blends the empirical with the spiritual, proving that the oldest stories we have may also be the most accurate maps we possess to a past we are only just beginning to remember. Of all the stories that shape human civilization, few hold as much power as the Exodus, the epic tale of the Israelites, enslaved in Egypt, who are miraculously liberated by their God through a series of plagues and a dramatic escape through a parted sea. It is the foundational narrative of Judaism, a cornerstone of Christianity and Islam, and a universal symbol of the struggle for freedom against oppression. But for all its profound religious and cultural weight, historians and archaeologists have long grappled with a tantalizing and deeply controversial question: did any of it actually happen? The search for evidence of the Exodus is one of the most contentious in all of archaeology, not because the story is unimportant, but precisely because it is so important. The quest to find proof on the ground forces us to confront the incredible power of a story to shape a people, even if its historical roots are more fragmented and complex than the biblical account suggests. The first challenge is the silence of the sands. Despite over a century of intensive excavation in the Nile Delta, the region of ancient Goshen where the Israelites were said to have lived, archaeologists have found no evidence of a large population of Semitic slaves in Egypt at the time the Exodus is traditionally set, around the 13th century BC. There are no mass graves, no sudden shifts in material culture, and no Egyptian records that mention the enslavement of a people called Israel or their dramatic departure. In fact, the sole mention of Israel in Egyptian records from this period is on the Mernept stele from around 1208 BCE, where it is listed among the conquered peoples of Canaan, suggesting that by that time, a group called Israel was already established in the highlands of what is now Palestine, not fleeing through the Sinai. This evidentiary void has led many scholars to conclude that the Exodus, as described in the Bible with its vast numbers over 600,000 men, implying a total population of over 2 million people, simply did not occur on that scale. Such a massive migration would have left an unmistakable archaeological footprint, and that footprint is nowhere to be found. Yet, to dismiss the entire narrative as pure fiction is to ignore the compelling historical echoes that resonate within it. The Bible may have condensed and dramatized a much longer and more complex process of ethnogenesis, the formation of a people. One of the most persuasive theories connects the Exodus story to the memory of the Hyksos period. The Hyksos were a group of Semitic-speaking peoples from the Levant who ruled parts of northern Egypt as pharaohs during the Second Intermediate Period, around 1650 to 1550 BC. They were eventually expelled by a native Egyptian dynasty in a war of liberation, fleeing back to Canaan. This was a real, documented event of Semitic rulers being driven out of Egypt. It's possible that over centuries, the memory of the Hyksos expulsion, a story of Semites leaving Egypt, blended with the experiences of other Semitic groups who lived in Egypt. Throughout the second millennium BC, it was common for Canaanites to migrate into the delta during times of famine, to work as traders, mercenaries, or laborers. The story of Joseph, a Semite who rises to power in Pharaoh's court, perfectly reflects this reality. The Grand Exodus narrative could therefore be a powerful fusion of these different memories, the expulsion of the powerful Hyksos, and the later experiences of smaller groups of Semitic migrants returning to their ancestral homeland, condensed over time into a single, epic story of a unified people's divine liberation. Another fascinating angle involves natural catastrophe. The Bible describes 10 plagues that ravage Egypt, the Nile turning to blood, darkness covering the land, hail and fire. These read less like magical punishments and more like a chain reaction of environmental disasters, the kind that could be triggered by a massive volcanic eruption. And we know of a prime candidate, the colossal eruption of Thera on Santorini, which occurred around 1600 BCE. This event, one of the largest in human history, would have had devastating effects across the region. Volcanic ash could have fouled the Nile, creating algal blooms that turned the water red and toxic, the first plague. This would have driven frogs onto the land, where they would die, the second plague, leading to an explosion of lice and flies, the third and fourth. The ash in the atmosphere could have led to unusual hail and lightning, the seventh plague, and created a volcanic winter that killed livestock, the fifth plague, and caused boils on the skin, the sixth plague. A dense plume of ash could have blotted out the sun for days, the ninth plague of darkness. Furthermore, a volcanic eruption of that magnitude can trigger tsunamis. Could the parting of the Red Sea, or more accurately the Reed Sea as some translations suggest, be a memory of a tsunami dramatically pulling water back before crashing back in, destroying the Egyptian chariots that gave pursuit? While the timing of the Thera eruption is slightly early for the standard Exodus timeline, it's possible the memory of this generation-defining cataclysm was woven into the story, explaining the plagues as divine instruments. Ultimately, whether the Exodus contains these historical kernels or not, its true, undeniable power lies in its function as a foundational myth. For the ancient Israelites, forging an identity in the highlands of Canaan while surrounded by powerful empires, this story answered the most critical questions. Who are we? We are the people whom God liberated from bondage. Why are our laws different? Because we made a covenant with that God at Sinai after our deliverance. Why must we care for the stranger and the oppressed? Because we were strangers and oppressed in the land of Egypt. The story provided a shared origin, a legal justification, and a moral imperative. It transformed a likely mixed population of Canaanite peasants, runaway slaves from various backgrounds, and semi-nomadic groups into a unified people, Israel, with a shared past and a shared destiny. The historical truth of the Exodus is, in a way, secondary to its historical function. It is a narrative so powerful, so compelling in its themes of resistance and hope, that it forged a national identity that has survived for millennia. It proves that a story doesn't need to be factually true in every detail to be historically true in its impact, providing a people with the ultimate weapon against despair, the memory, however shaped by time, of having been freed. Now let us set sail on the greatest exploration saga in human history, a journey not across land, but across the vast, empty expanse of the Pacific Ocean, guided not by maps, but by stars, waves, and the stories of a trickster god. The Polynesian demigod Maui is one of the most vibrant and beloved figures in world mythology. He is the divine prankster, the shape-shifter who slows the sun with his rope, who pulls islands from the sea with his magical fishhook, who discovers the secret of fire for humanity. These are wonderful, magical tales, but to view them as mere fantasy is to miss their true, breathtaking genius. For woven into the very fabric of these stories is a sophisticated, practical, and incredibly accurate system of oceanic navigation and exploration that allowed the Polynesian people to discover and settle the last uninhabited corners of our planet. The Maui legends are not just stories about the gods, they are the encoded logbooks of the world's most brilliant voyagers. Consider the most famous of Maui's deeds, fishing up the islands. The story varies across the Pacific, but its core is consistent. From his canoe, Maui casts his great magical fishhook, often baited with blood from his own nose, and he hauls up from the depths of the ocean a great fish, which becomes an island. In the Hawaiian version, this fish becomes the island of Hawaii itself. In the Maori tradition of New Zealand, his great canoe becomes the South Island, and his fish becomes the North Island, which to this day carries the Maori name Te Ika e Moi, the fish of Maui. On the surface, it's a classic creation myth, but when you view it through the lens of a master navigator, it transforms into something else entirely, a perfect metaphor for the moment of landfall. For a people who spent weeks at sea, the first sighting of a new, high island on the horizon would have felt exactly like a fisherman hauling a gigantic catch from the unseen depths. The island doesn't just appear, it emerges, rising slowly and majestically from the ocean. The metaphor is so visceral, so accurate to the experience, that it could only have been born from the genuine awe of discovery. The story preserves the memory not of a single event, but of the repeated, triumphant moment of finding a new home. This narrative function becomes even more apparent when we examine the skills required for such voyages. The Polynesian expansion across the Pacific was not a series of accidental drifts. It was a deliberate, two-way exploration and colonization of an ocean covering nearly 16 million square miles, an area larger than all the Earth's landmasses combined. They achieved this with canoes, double-hulled vessels like the Vaatella that could carry dozens of people, plants, and animals, and with a system of wayfinding called Cape Huwetu in Maori or Haukul in Hawaiian, that is one of the highest achievements of human intuition and observation. These navigators used a living, moving map. They memorized the rising and setting points of hundreds of stars, using them as a celestial compass. They read the subtle patterns of ocean swells, feeling how they reflected and bent around islands beyond the horizon. They watched for specific species of birds, knowing their flight range would point the way to land. They observed cloud formations, which often gather stationary over an island, and the color of the water, which could change with the depth and presence of lagoons. This was a science of perception, a way of seeing the invisible, and the myths of Maui are a curriculum for this science. His slowing of the sun is not just a fun trick, it is a profound observation of the solar cycle and its importance in navigation. His quest for fire is a foundational story about the essential technology needed to survive on a new island. Most importantly, the stories themselves served as vital mnemonic devices. The oral charts of the Polynesian navigators were not lists of coordinates. They were chants, stories, and songs that packaged complex navigational information into a memorable, transmissible form. The story of Maui's fishhook, for instance, might encode the star path or the swell pattern that leads to a specific island group. The character of Maui himself, the clever trickster who uses his wits to overcome impossible challenges, is the perfect archetype for the navigator, whose survival depends not on brute force, but on intelligence, patience, and a deep, respectful dialogue with nature. The most powerful proof of this deep connection between myth and practical knowledge comes from its modern revival. By the mid-20th century, this ancient art of wayfinding had nearly been lost, replaced by charts and GPS. But in the 1970s, a cultural renaissance began, sparked by the Polynesian Voyaging Society and led by master navigators like Mau Piailug from the small island of Satawal in Micronesia. He possessed this ancestral knowledge and, recognizing it was dying, made the courageous decision to share it with Hawaiians who had lost the practice. In 1976, he navigated the newly built double-hulled canoe, the Folklore, from Hawaii to Tahiti without the use of any instruments, no compass, no sextant, no radio. He used only the stars, the swells, the birds, and the clouds. It was a journey that stunned the world and proved definitively that the stories of epic voyages were not only possible, but were almost certainly how the islands were settled. The Folklore's success was more than a nautical feat. It was a cultural resurrection. It validated the wisdom held within the old chants and stories, proving that the Maui legends were not childish fables but the distilled, poetic essence of a real, empirical science of exploration. The demigod's magical fishhook was, in reality, the navigator's unshakable knowledge cast into the ocean of the unknown, always pulling the promise of land from the depths. From the vast expanse of the Pacific, we now journey into the misty highlands and deep forests of ancient Europe, to a culture whose reverence for the human head shaped both their sacred rituals and their most enduring legends. For the Celtic peoples who once dominated much of the continent, the head was far more than just a body part. It was considered the very seat of the soul, the vessel of a person's essence, wisdom, and life force. This belief, deeply embedded in their spirituality, manifested in practices that might seem gruesome to modern eyes but were profoundly sacred to them. After a battle, it was common for Celtic warriors to take the heads of their most valiant foes as trophies, but this was not merely about displaying prowess. They believed that by possessing the head of a powerful enemy, they could capture and harness that person's strength, preventing their spirit from seeking revenge and transferring their courage to the victor. These heads were not discarded. They were carefully preserved in cedar oil, displayed prominently in temples and on the gates of hill forts, and even used in rituals to seek prophecies. The physical practice of head veneration was so central to their worldview that it inevitably bled into their mythology, creating some of the most haunting and powerful narratives in Celtic lore, where severed heads continue to speak, prophesy, and protect long after the body has fallen. A stunning archaeological window into this world can be found at the Oppidum of Intremont in southern France, a stronghold of the Saluvii tribe. Here, excavators uncovered a chilling and unequivocal testament to the Celtic head cult. A sanctuary revealed a series of stone pillars, and carved into these pillars were niches displaying carved stone heads. But more striking still were the actual skulls, real human heads, that had been meticulously nailed to the structure, their presence sanctifying the space. Even more evocative are the carved reliefs at Intremont, which show rows of headless horsemen, with their severed heads carried in their hands or displayed on their horses. This isn't art imitating life. It is a direct fusion of ritual and belief, a permanent record of a practice that was central to their understanding of power and the afterlife. The message is clear: the power of the individual, their very identity and strength, resided in the head, and controlling that head meant controlling that power. This archaeological evidence provides the solid historical foundation upon which the myths were built. When we read the ancient Irish and Welsh stories, we are not encountering pure fantasy. We are seeing the poetic and narrative reflection of a very real, deeply held spiritual practice. No story illustrates this entanglement of history and legend more vividly than the Welsh tale of Bran the Blessed, a giant and king of ancient Britain. After being mortally wounded in a great battle against the Irish, Bran gives his followers a final, bizarre command. He instructs them to cut off his head and carry it with them back to London, assuring them that it will remain their companion and protector. The men do as instructed, and Bran's head does indeed remain alive, talking and feasting with them for 87 years on their long journey, acting as a source of wisdom and solace before finally falling silent. The men then bury the head in the White Hill in London, facing towards France to protect the island from foreign invasion. This story is a direct mythological projection of the Celtic head cult. Bran's talking head is the ultimate expression of the belief that the soul's power persists in the skull. It transforms the historical practice of displaying heads for protection into an epic narrative of a guardian deity whose severed head literally becomes a talisman for the entire nation. The story explains and sanctifies the ritual, giving it a divine origin and a cosmic purpose. This theme of the prophetic talking head echoes throughout the Celtic tradition. In the Ulster cycle of Irish mythology, the hero Conall Cernach avenges his friend by taking the head of his killer, and the head continues to speak, reciting poetry and prophecies even after its separation from the body. These narratives served multiple purposes. They explained the world, why a particular hill was named a certain way, or why a tribe believed they were protected. They also provided a framework for understanding the soul's journey, suggesting that consciousness was not instantly extinguished at death but could linger, especially if the head was treated with reverence. The myths validated the rituals, and the rituals, in turn, gave the myths a tangible, terrifying reality. The line between the spiritual belief and the story told around the fire becomes beautifully blurred. A warrior who had seen heads displayed at a sanctuary like in Tremont would have heard the story of Bran with a shiver of recognition, and the storyteller, perhaps, would have pointed to a real skull on a gatepost as proof of the legend's truth. The Celtic head cult shows us with stunning clarity how a specific, tangible religious practice, one that leaves clear archaeological evidence, can be the seed for some of humanity's most powerful and enduring myths. The rituals answer the spiritual need to understand the soul and death, while the stories provide a narrative framework that makes those rituals meaningful, memorable, and sacred across generations. Within the stark, beautiful landscapes of the American Southwest, a very different kind of shape-shifting narrative emerges, one rooted not in ancient cataclysms but in the intimate, chilling fears of community life. The legends of the Skinwalker, known in Navajo as Yi Noldlushai, he who walks on all fours, are among the most potent and guarded stories in Native American folklore. These are not tales of gods or ancient heroes, but of witches, individuals who have gained monstrous power through the ultimate transgression, the willing shedding of their humanity. By committing a terrible act, often the killing of a close relative, they are said to gain the ability to transform at will into animals, most commonly wolves, coyotes, bears, or owls, to travel with supernatural speed and to sow sickness and discord among their own people. To approach these stories requires immense respect, for they are not mere campfire tales. They are deeply embedded in the spiritual and social fabric of the Dene people and other southwestern tribes, serving as a powerful, dark reflection of the community's deepest anxieties about internal betrayal and the fragile balance between harmony and chaos. The historical context of these narratives is crucial to understanding their power. For the Navajo and their neighbors, like the Ute and Pueblo peoples, survival in a harsh environment depended on an intricate web of community trust, cooperation, and strict adherence to cultural and spiritual laws known as Hajawaji, the way of walking in beauty and balance. Any rupture in this social fabric, whether through witchcraft, greed, or violence, wasn't just a personal failing, it was a threat to the entire group's well-being. The Skinwalker legend can be seen as a cultural vessel for processing the terror of precisely this kind of internal threat. During periods of extreme stress, drought, famine, or the intense pressures of colonial encroachment, communities would have been strained to their breaking point. Suspicion would flourish, and the unexplained illness of a child, the sudden death of livestock, or a string of bad luck would demand an explanation that made sense within their worldview. The concept of the Skinwalker provided that explanation. It personified misfortune not as a random event, but as the deliberate malice of a corrupted individual who had chosen to break the most sacred taboos for personal gain. This wasn't an external monster, it was the ultimate insider threat, a neighbor or even a family member who had turned against everything the community stood for. This function as a social regulator cannot be overstated. The stories served as a powerful deterrent, reinforcing cultural norms by presenting a terrifying cautionary tale about the consequences of violating them. The price of becoming a skinwalker was the complete loss of one's soul and identity, forever being ostracized and feared. Furthermore, the legends often encode very real, historical fears of cultural contamination and conflict. As different tribes interacted, sometimes trading, sometimes warring, the stories of witches who could infiltrate and harm a community from within may have reflected genuine anxieties about outsiders or the dangerous adoption of foreign, malevolent spiritual practices. The Skinwalker is the shape-shifter who blurs all boundaries between human and animal, between community member and enemy, between the natural and the unnatural. In doing so, the folklore provides a framework for understanding the complex and often terrifying reality of living in a world where the greatest dangers can sometimes come from within one's own circle, teaching eternal vigilance and the paramount importance of maintaining social and spiritual order. Across the globe, the dragon is often a beast to be slain, a symbol of chaos vanquished by a heroic savior. But in China, the dragon, or Chinese letter long, occupies a space of unparalleled reverence. It is not a monster to be defeated, but a divine force of nature, a benevolent bringer of rain, and the ultimate symbol of imperial power and cosmic harmony. This unique cultural icon, so central to Chinese identity for millennia, presents a fascinating question. Could this magnificent, serpentine creature have slithered into the human imagination from the very earth itself, born from a combination of discovered bones and observed weather? The Chinese dragon is a masterful blend of multiple animals: the horns of a stag, the head of a camel, the eyes of a demon, the neck of a snake, the belly of a clam, the scales of a carp, the claws of an eagle, and the paws of a tiger. This composite nature suggests it was not modeled on any single living creature, but rather synthesized from a deep, long-term observation of the natural world, both in the sky above and in the ground below. One of the most compelling theories for the dragon's origin lies in the ancient discovery of fossils. For centuries, Chinese farmers and scholars unearthed enormous, bizarre bones that bore no resemblance to any known animal. These were, of course, the remains of dinosaurs and other prehistoric megafauna. An ancient text from the 4th century BCE, the classic of mountains and seas, describes the burial places of dragons, which some historians believe were actually sites where such fossils were commonly found. Without the framework of paleontology, how would an ancient culture interpret the gigantic skeleton of a sauropod dinosaur, with its monstrously long neck, massive ribs, and clawed feet. It is not difficult to imagine them piecing these remains together in their minds and concluding they belong to a giant, serpentine-scaled creature, a dragon. The famous historian Chang, writing in the 3rd century CE, even recorded the discovery of dragon bones in Wucheng, which were often ground into powder for use in traditional medicine, a practice that continues in some regions to this day. These physical, tangible remains provided a skeletal foundation upon which the myth could be built, offering proof that such magnificent beasts had once walked the earth. But the dragon was more than just a fossilized relic. It was a living, breathing force in the sky. The dragon's primary role in Chinese cosmology is as the master of water and weather, the divine agent responsible for bringing the life-giving rains essential for agriculture. This connection is almost certainly born from the observation of powerful meteorological phenomena. Imagine a people entirely dependent on the monsoon rains for their survival, watching the sky for any sign of relief during a drought. They would see the twisting, coiling form of a tornado or waterspout descending from the thunderheads, and see the body of a celestial dragon dipping its tail into the rivers to draw up water. They would witness the sinuous flow of a river from a high vantage point and see the serpentine path of an earthbound dragon. The lightning that cracked across the sky could be interpreted as the dragon's flashing talons or the glimpse of its glowing scales. The thunder was its mighty roar. In this way, the dragon became the personification of the awesome, unpredictable, and vital power of the weather. It was a way to make sense of the uncontrollable forces that dictated their survival, giving them a form that could be understood, respected, and crucially petitioned through ritual and sacrifice. This role as a rainmaker inextricably linked the dragon to imperial authority. The emperor was considered the son of heaven, the sole human intermediary between the celestial order and the earthly realm. His mandate to rule was directly tied to his ability to maintain balance and harmony, which included ensuring favorable weather and bountiful harvests. The dragon became his exclusive symbol. The emperor's throne was the dragon throne, his face the dragon countenance, his robes embroidered with 5 clawed dragons, a motif forbidden to all others. This was not mere decoration, it was a powerful piece of political propaganda. By aligning himself with the dragon, the emperor was claiming a divine right to rule based on his unique connection to the forces of nature. A drought or a devastating flood was therefore not just a natural disaster. It was a sign that the emperor had lost the favor of heaven, that his connection to the dragon had weakened, and that his mandate was in jeopardy. The myth of the dragon was thus woven into the very fabric of statecraft, providing a cosmological justification for power and a built-in mechanism for holding that power accountable to the well-being of the people and the land. The dragon's journey from a possible fossil to a weather spirit to an imperial emblem shows us how a single myth can evolve to meet the deepest needs of a culture, explaining the unexplainable, legitimizing power, and offering a sliver of hope that the rains will always, eventually, return. But perhaps no figure in world folklore embodies the spirit of resistance and the cunning of the underdog more perfectly than Anansi, the trickster spider. Hailing from the Akan people of West Africa, Anansi crossed the Atlantic not in the hold of a ship as a free creature, but woven into the very minds and memories of the enslaved Africans who were forced to make that horrific journey. In his original Ashanti homeland, Anansi was already a beloved, complex character, a god of stories, a symbol of wisdom and creativity, but also a flawed, greedy, and often hilarious figure who used his wits to overcome larger, stronger opponents. He was a cultural hero who taught that brains will always triumph over brawn. But in the brutal new world of the plantation, this ancient trickster was called upon to perform a much heavier, more vital duty. He became a secret weapon, a psychological lifeline, and a masterclass in coded communication for people living under the constant, crushing weight of oppression. The plantation system was designed to be a machine of dehumanization, aimed at stripping the enslaved of their culture, their language, their family ties, and their very will to resist. In this environment, open rebellion was suicide. Directly challenging the overseer's whip or the master's authority was a quick way to meet a terrible end. So resistance had to become subtle, creative, and invisible to the eyes of the oppressor. This is where Anansi found his new purpose. The old stories from Africa, told in the quiet of the night in slave quarters or sung while working in the fields, were not just a comfort, they were a training manual. In every tale where clever Anansi outwits a tiger, a leopard, or a giant, all clear stand-ins for the slave master and his powerful system, the listeners were receiving a crucial lesson. They were learning the art of subversion. The stories taught that you could win without direct confrontation. You could use flattery, deception, misdirection, and sheer cleverness to turn your enemy's strength against him, to secure a larger share of food, to get out of an impossible task, or to simply preserve your own dignity and spirit in a world hell-bent on destroying it. This narrative strategy transformed the stories into a form of encrypted communication. When an enslaved person told a story about Anansi pretending to be foolish to trick a powerful animal into doing all the work, they weren't just entertaining the children. They were sharing a tactic. They were saying, "This is how we can survive today." The humor itself was a shield. The white masters often saw these tales as simple, amusing Negro folklore, little understanding that they were witnessing a sophisticated culture laughing at them, plotting against them, and affirming its own intelligence right under their noses. The spider's web became the perfect metaphor for this invisible network of resistance, a delicate, interconnected structure that was almost impossible to see until you were already caught in it. Through Anansi, the enslaved could assert their mental superiority, their agency, and their will to outsmart the system, even when their bodies were not their own. It was a way to win small, crucial victories for the soul, proving that while the master might own the field, he did not own the imagination. As generations passed and the diaspora spread across the Caribbean and into the Americas, Anansi did not fade. He evolved, absorbing the flavors and struggles of each new land. In Jamaica, he became Anansi, a central figure in the oral tradition who spoke in the rich, metaphorical patois of the island. In the Sea Islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, where the Gullah Geechee people preserved a vast amount of West African culture, stories of the trickster spider thrived. This evolution is a stunning testament to the resilience of African traditions. They were not erased, they adapted. Anansi became a pan-African symbol, a thread connecting people from different tribes and nations who had been torn from their homes but who found a common identity in this shared, clever hero. He was a living reminder that their culture could not be killed, that it could travel and put down roots in the most barren and hostile of soils. In the modern era, Anansi's journey continues. He has been embraced as a potent symbol of post-colonial identity and Black empowerment. Writers like Neil Gaiman have introduced him to new global audiences in works like American Gods, while Caribbean authors continue to celebrate him as a vital part of their literary heritage. His story is the ultimate shape-shifting narrative because it is about the act of shape-shifting itself. It is about the power of the weak to overcome the strong through intelligence, the power of culture to survive the worst attempts at its destruction, and the power of a good story to carry a people's history, their pain, and their unbreakable hope across oceans and through centuries. Anansi whispers a timeless truth that the sharpest weapon isn't a sword or a whip, it's a well-told tale, and the cleverest trick of all is ensuring that story is never, ever forgotten. And so we arrive at the final, and perhaps most elusive, shape-shifting narrative in our journey, the legend of the Holy Grail. Woven into the later tapestry of the Arthurian cycle, the Grail is the ultimate object of quest, a symbol so potent and multifaceted that its meaning seems to transform with every telling. On the surface, the story is clear. A sacred vessel, often identified as the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, resides in a mysterious castle guarded by a wounded king. The land lies blighted, a wasteland, and only a knight pure enough to ask the correct question can heal the king and restore the realm. But to view the Grail as a simple Christian relic is to miss the deep, ancient currents that flow beneath this story. The quest for the Grail is not a historical treasure hunt. It is a profound spiritual and psychological allegory that draws from a well of human longing far older than Christianity itself, making it the perfect culmination of our exploration into how history disguises itself as folklore. One of the most compelling theories traces the Grail's lineage back to the pagan Celtic world. Long before the Knights of the Round Table sought a chalice, the myths of Wales and Ireland spoke of magical cauldrons that provided endless nourishment, brought the dead back to life, and could reveal the future. The most famous is the Cauldron of the Dagda in Irish myth, a vessel of plenty that no company ever left unsatisfied. In the Welsh Mabinogion, the hero Bran the Blessed possesses a cauldron of rebirth. These artifacts were not mere pots, they were central symbols of sovereignty, divinity, and the regenerative power of the land itself. When Christian scribes like Cretan de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach began writing the first Grail romances in the 12th century, they were likely drawing upon these deep-seated Celtic myths that had survived for centuries in oral tradition. They performed a masterful act of narrative alchemy, baptizing the pagan cauldron into a Christian chalice. The vessel that provided endless food became the vessel that held the divine blood of Christ, and the quest to restore the wasteland transformed from a pagan fertility right into a Christian parable of spiritual redemption. The historical kernel here is not a specific object, but a universal human yearning for a source of ultimate healing and abundance, a yearning that predates the Church and was simply clothed in its most contemporary sacred imagery. This process of adaptation becomes even more fascinating when we consider the theory linking the Grail to the Cathars, a Christian dualist sect that flourished in the south of France in the 12th and 13th centuries. The Cathars held beliefs that were considered deeply heretical by the Catholic Church, including the idea that the physical world was evil and created by a false god, and that salvation came through a secret knowledge or gnosis of the true spiritual realm. They were brutally crushed in the Albigensian Crusade. Some scholars, like Otto Rahn in the 20th century, theorized that the Grail legends, particularly Wolfram von Eschenbach's version, which describes the Grail as a stone, were coded narratives about the Cathar faith and the refuge of its last adherents. In this reading, the Grail is not a physical cup, but a symbol of this hidden gnosis, the secret knowledge that could liberate the soul from the prison of the material world. The wounded Fisher King represents the Cathar community itself, persecuted and bleeding, waiting for a savior to ask the right question and bring healing. The quest then becomes an allegory for the spiritual pursuit of enlightenment against the backdrop of very real, very bloody historical religious persecution. The story shape shifts to preserve the memory of a suppressed theology, hiding its secrets in plain sight within a popular romance. Yet perhaps the most enduring power of the Grail myth is its psychological dimension, a reading that feels profoundly relevant even today. The psychologist Carl Jung saw the Grail as a powerful symbol of the self, the ultimate goal of individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated person. The wounded king represents a state of inner sickness where parts of the psyche are cut off or neglected. The blighted wasteland is the internal landscape of a life lived without meaning or connection to the deeper self. The quest, then, is an inward journey. Each knight who sets out represents a different aspect of the human personality. Percival's naive purity, Lancelot's worldly passion thwarted by his sin, Galahad's perfect but almost inhuman spirituality. The question that must be asked, whom does the Grail serve, is the crucial turning point of self-awareness. It shifts the focus from the ego's desire to possess the sacred to a humble understanding of one's place in service to a higher purpose. The healing of the king and the restoration of the wasteland symbolize the incredible renewal that occurs when an individual achieves inner wholeness. This interpretation allows the Grail to transcend any specific historical or religious context, becoming a timeless story about the human search for meaning, purpose, and psychological completeness. Throughout history, the Grail has continued to shape-shift to meet the needs of every new era. In the Victorian age, it was romanticized and spiritualized by poets like Tennyson. In the 20th century, it was fused with conspiracy theories and alternate history in tales of secret bloodlines, most famously in the Da Vinci Code. In our modern, secular world, the Grail has become a metaphor for any ultimate but elusive goal: the cure for cancer, the source of clean energy, a state of perfect happiness. This incredible adaptability is the final proof of its power. The Grail is the ultimate shape-shifting narrative because it is, at its core, an empty vessel. It has no single, fixed identity. It is a cup, a cauldron, a stone, a secret, a psychological state. We pour into it whatever we most desire, whatever we most need to seek. It perfectly encapsulates the themes we have seen again and again: the quest for meaning, the transformation of trauma into story, and the human drive to disguise our deepest historical and spiritual longings in the enduring, captivating language of myth. The Grail is not something to be found, but a story that is forever being retold, and in that retelling, we continually rediscover and redefine what it is we are truly searching for. So what do these 20 incredible stories, spanning every corner of the globe and thousands of years of human experience, ultimately teach us? They reveal a profound and universal human impulse, a kind of narrative alchemy we perform on the raw material of our past. We don't just record history, we transform it. We take the stark, often traumatic facts of what happened, and we pour them into the molds of story, symbol, and myth. This isn't a sign of a primitive mind or a failure of memory. It is, in fact, one of our species' most sophisticated and resilient technologies for survival. At its core, this transformation from history to folklore serves four essential human needs: to make sense of chaos, to preserve what matters, to teach who we are, and to heal what was broken. The most powerful driver is the need to process collective trauma. A volcanic eruption, a devastating flood, a brutal invasion. These events are so cataclysmic they can shatter a community's understanding of the world. The human psyche cannot easily cope with such random, meaningless suffering, so we create a story. We give the incomprehensible a face and a name. The tsunami becomes a wrathful god. The invading army becomes a race of monsters. The pandemic becomes a plague of divine punishment. By framing the trauma within a narrative, we give it a beginning, a middle, and an end. We inject it with moral cause and effect. This is what the scholar Mircea Eliade meant when he described myth as a means of returning to a sacred time of origins. It's a way of reasserting order onto chaos, of making the unbearable intelligible. The Norse memory of the Fimbulwinter became the epic of Ragnarok. The real-life destruction of Thera became the moral fable of Atlantis. The story becomes a psychological tool, allowing a people to carry the memory of the event without being crushed by its existential weight. It is how we stare into the abyss and find a way to tell a tale about it. Secondly, folklore acts as a breathtakingly durable oral archive. Long before writing, this was how knowledge was preserved across generations. But it wasn't about memorizing dry lists of kings or dates. Oral tradition, as historian Jan Vansinne documented, is a living process that prioritizes the survival of culturally vital information. The structure of stories, with their rhythms, rhymes, and repetitive patterns, makes them far easier to remember than raw data. The Polynesian myths of Maui aren't just fun adventures about a trickster god. They are encoded navigation charts, storing crucial information about star paths, ocean currents, and the signs of landfall in a memorable, transmissible form. The Aboriginal Dreamtime stories are a perfect example, embedding thousands of years of geographical and ecological knowledge into the very landscape itself, turning every mountain and river into a mnemonic device. The facts might blur at the edges. The 10-year siege of Troy was likely a series of conflicts. The Great Exodus was probably a smaller migration, but the core emotional and cultural truth is preserved with incredible fidelity. The story becomes the ship, and the historical memory is the precious cargo it carries across the centuries. This leads us to the third function, encoding moral and cultural identity. A story is the most powerful vehicle ever invented for teaching values. The legend of King Arthur isn't just about a post-Roman warlord. It's a lesson on what makes a good king, a just ruler, and a noble knight. The tale of the Minotaur isn't merely a monster story. It's a piece of Athenian propaganda that justifies their own culture by demonizing their former Minoan overlords. Folklore draws a bright line between us and them, defining a community's values by showcasing what it fears and what it reveres. The Navajo Skinwalker stories are a powerful social regulator, reinforcing taboos by illustrating the horrific consequences of breaking them. These narratives answer the fundamental questions of identity. Who are we? Where do we come from? What do we believe? They provide a shared foundation of belief and behavior that binds a people together, giving them a common story to belong to. Finally, the work of psychologists like Carl Jung helps us understand the deepest layer of this process, the archetypal. Jung proposed that humanity shares a collective unconscious, a deep well of universal symbols and story patterns, or archetypes, that shape our myths. The hero, the mother, the trickster, the flood, the quest, these are not inventions but inheritances. They are the fundamental building blocks of human storytelling. This is why cultures that have never met all have a flood myth or a trickster figure. When a historical event resonates with one of these deep archetypes, when a real-life leader's deeds echo the hero's journey, or a catastrophic event mirrors the Great Flood, the story is elevated from a local memory to a timeless myth. It gains a power that transcends its original context, speaking to something fundamental in all of us. The quest for the Holy Grail is the perfect example, transforming from a possible Celtic cauldron to a Christian relic to a psychological symbol of the search for wholeness. The archetype provides a universal framework, and the historical event provides the specific content, creating a story that is both particular and perpetual. In the end, the transformation of history into folklore is not a distortion of the truth, but a transcendence of it. We are not just record keepers, we are meaning makers. We take the clay of factual events and sculpt it into something that can comfort, guide, and inspire us long after the original moment has passed. These shape-shifting narratives are the ultimate testament to human resilience. They prove that our greatest legacy is not written in stone but etched in story, ensuring that even when empires fall and cities crumble, the memory of who we were and the lessons we learned will always find a way to survive. And so this incredible journey through 20 shape-shifting narratives brings us to a single, profound realization. Folklore is not merely fantasy. It is not a collection of childish fictions invented to pass the time. It is something far more powerful and far more human. It is history in disguise. It is the alchemy of memory, a process by which real events, real people, and real traumas are transformed into stories durable enough to survive centuries, flexible enough to adapt to new cultures, and powerful enough to carry the emotional weight of our deepest collective experiences. We have seen how a catastrophic flood that reshaped coastlines 12,000 years ago became a universal myth of divine punishment and renewal. We have witnessed how the terrifying memory of a volcanic eruption that obliterated a civilization was polished into the philosophical warning of Atlantis. From the historical kernel of a Dark Age warlord, we watched the legend of a once and future king be forged. These are not lies. They are the way a culture remembers, the way a people process the unimaginable and ensure that what matters most is never, ever forgotten. Recognizing this secret life of stories fundamentally deepens our appreciation for every myth, every folktale, and every legend we encounter. It asks us to listen more closely, to look beyond the surface of dragons and heroes and magical artifacts, and to ask a different set of questions. Instead of asking, "Did this happen?" we can begin to ask, "What real experience is this story trying to preserve? What truth is it keeping safe?" This shift in perspective turns every ancient narrative into a potential puzzle, a coded message from the past waiting to be deciphered. It allows us to see the Aboriginal Dreamtime stories not as simple creation myths, but as a sophisticated oral library of ecological knowledge. It lets us hear the Anansi tales not just as amusing trickster fables, but as vital manuals of subversion and survival for an enslaved people. When we understand that folklore is often history's most resilient vessel, we begin to appreciate the incredible ingenuity and resilience of the human spirit itself. Our stories are our survival mechanism. This narrative alchemy is what the great mythologist J.R.R. Tolkien understood so perfectly when he wrote that in the greatest of tales, legend and history have met and fused. They are not two separate things, but two essential parts of a whole. The facts provide the spark, but the story provides the meaning, the warmth, and the light that allows that spark to travel through time. The next time you hear an old family story, a local ghost tale, or an ancient myth from a culture halfway around the world, I encourage you to pause for a moment. Look past the magical elements and ask yourself what hidden history might be nestled within it. Could that story of a haunted battlefield be preserving the trauma of a real, forgotten conflict? Could that legend of a sunken city point to the memory of a lost coastline? There are truths hidden in plain sight all around us, waiting in the stories we've been telling each other for millennia. We would love to hear from you on this journey. What is your favorite shape-shifting narrative? Is there a local legend from your part of the world that you've always suspected might contain a kernel of historical truth? Share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. Let's continue this exploration together. And if you want to join us as we unravel more of the world's greatest mysteries, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you don't miss our next adventure into the past. Thank you for watching, and remember, the oldest stories are often the ones